hello and welcome to this is a public lecture and a discussion on Australia's escalating biodiversity crisis, which thanks to you, the audience, and to the panel we've assembled tonight, I think is going to have a distinctly West Australian flavour. So to introduce myself, I'm Nikki Mitchell. I'm Deputy Director of the Oceans Institute and also a member of the Biodiversity Council and also involved with the Public Policy Institute, so all three organisations, two of which are based at UWA and one UWA as a partner with. So I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. Firstly, to acknowledge that the University of West Australia's campuses are situated on Noongar land and that their people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of the land and continue to practice their values, languages, cultures and knowledge. And of course also pay my respects to the Whadjuk people as the traditional owners of the Wellbeing area in Fremantle where we meet tonight, and to the First Nations people who are with us today. So before I introduce our speaker, Brendan Wintle, I'd just like to say a few words about the public lecture series the Oceans Institute has instigated, which we started last year. So about a year ago, we were here in this very room discussing the climate crisis, particularly in the light of new research that has shown in some parts of the world we've already reached 2 degrees of warming relative to the pre-industrial baseline. So we followed this with a public lecture loosely titled Unpacking Nature Positive. So anyone put their hand up if they were at that Nature Positive one last year, because I recognise some of you are back, which is great. So this is in some ways a bit of a look at the same topic a year later, but with a very different speaker's perspective. The last one was more about nature finance. This is a bit more about the reality of where we're heading. And we think it's really important as the Oceans Institute to have these important conversations that affect us all in a public space. And this is the very first time that we've joined forces with the Biodiversity Council. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brendan Wintle, our speaker. So Brendan is from the University of Melbourne, and he's the director of the Melbourne's Biodiversity Institute. And his research develops economic ecological methods that support biodiversity conservation decisions and policy. So before this, Brendan was the director of the Australia's Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and he was the theme leader of the Centre of Excellence in Environmental Decisions, and he's currently a coordinating lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service. And very relevant for tonight, Brendan was one of the founders of the Biodiversity Council, and he's one of the lead councillors for Australia's Council. So without further ado, Brendan, I hope the next slide is yours, and I'll hand the floor to you.
Thanks so much, Nikki, and thanks everyone for coming along. I'm going to do a small awkward moment where I'm flashing between glasses and no glasses. It's new for me, this glasses thing, so bear with me. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that we're on Whadjuk land, and I want to acknowledge the Whadjuk people as the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whose lands I live and work in Naarm in Melbourne, and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience tonight. I understand that in the Noongar language, the Fremantle area is called Walyalup, as meaning the place of the woylie, and I bloody love woylies, and so I'm really glad to be here in the place of the woylie, and so there's my little nod to the woylie. I'd also like to acknowledge that a lot of the work, my work and the work of the Biodiversity Council, is around seeking to understand and redress the damage caused to country and people by colonisation and theft and dispossession, and through our work try and progress recognition of that, reconciliation and reciprocity. The Biodiversity Council is expressly set up, or specifically set up, to provide a strong Indigenous voice. We have 1/3 Indigenous councillors, including a couple of fantastic Indigenous councillors from WA that we're very lucky to have. Finally, tonight I'd like to thank Nikki Mitchell and the Oceans Institute for inviting me to speak here on Whadjuk country. It's a great privilege always to address a passionate and knowledgeable audience. So I thank you all for coming, and I look forward to you challenging my view of the world and probably ducking some of the more difficult questions so that my amazing panel can answer those instead. And Nick will introduce who those people are when I've finished carping on about biodiversity decline. So today I'm just going to start with a bit of an Australian and global biodiversity context, biodiversity decline context, talk a bit about the policy context that we're currently in globally and nationally, and what some of the opportunities and challenges are for us over the next little while around a couple of key issues. So that's the broad outline for my talk. So starting with that broad biodiversity context. Of course, and it's probably no great surprise to people in this room, and certainly I'm not expecting to be too challenged on the notion that nature underpins all aspects of our health, our well-being, our prosperity. We know that 70% of medicines are natural or copies of natural compounds, and about half the people on the planet still are solely reliant on natural medicines. We know that the cognitive development of children who are lucky enough to grow up in biodiverse environments and even in biodiverse schoolyards is greater and more rapid than the cognitive development of children who are deprived of that privilege. The World Economic Forum tells us that about half of global GDP is directly dependent on nature, which is, a lot of GDP, but it's of course a bit of an odd statistic. If we continue to see dramatic declines in nature, the unweaving of the fabric that supports our society, then we will see dramatic disconnection, famine and dislocation of peoples. And so that statistic's a bit odd. About 75% of crops are animal pollinated, and that represents around 35% of global food production. And of course, if we're going to meet our targets for limiting the impacts, limiting the extent and impacts of climate change, then we have to look after the biosphere, that is fixing, securing all of those greenhouse gases. And at the moment, we're emitting around 12 gigatons of greenhouse gas every year, and the biosphere's managing to sink or fix around half of that. If we continue to degrade ecosystems and the ability of the biosphere to secure those greenhouse gases, then we're going to undermine any chance that we had of actually meeting our goals for limiting the impacts of climate change. But unfortunately, nature's ability to provide these gifts to humanity is declining, and it's declining everywhere. Nikki mentioned before that I was involved in the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's a bit of a mouthful, but you can just think of it as the sort of biodiversity and ecosystems version of the IPCC. If you haven't already, check out the IPBES Global Assessment. It's a fantastic summary, even though it's at 2019 now. It's a fantastic summary of sort of the state and trends in nature. Even if you just read the summary for policymakers, it's a really fantastic piece of work that involved literally thousands of nature experts and practitioners from across the planet, science experts, Indigenous experts, pulling together the existing evidence around what's happening with nature and with ecosystem services. And, there's a few things that we know. Seems my pointer is no longer working, but if we look up at the top there, habitat creation and maintenance, the big blue circle indicates that that's well established. The arrow pointing down is that it's a strong downward 50-year decline globally. The donut indicates that it's consistent everywhere, and that right-hand column gives you some indicators that are used as evidence around that change. I've already mentioned one of the challenges in terms of food production, that second row there, pollination, the ability of nature to provide the pollination services and the dispersal of seeds and other propagules is also dramatically declining on a 50-year global trend. It's a well-established, and we're talking about pollinator diversity. And we've already seen in some parts of the planet, including in continental Europe, evidence of up to 75% declines over 30 years in insect biomass. That's a huge, huge potential challenge for our global food systems and also the ecosystems that are basically underpinned by invertebrates. And coming down to the bottom there, the regulation of detrimental organisms, think COVID, the regulation of hazards and extreme events, think fire, storm surge, nature's ability to provide us with protection and resilience against these processes is declining everywhere. And of course, one of the sort of signs, I guess, of ecosystem decline, ecosystem collapse is the loss of the individual components of those ecosystems, so the actual individual species. And this is a bit of work that comes out of, well, you can find it in the IPBES. It was originally pulled together by the Living Planet, and it shows the loss, the cumulative loss of species in different taxonomic groups since the 1500s, so since the sort of start of the Industrial Revolution. And you can see, for example, that mammals have had a consistent decline through the 1500s to the present time due to overexploitation, harvesting, and also habitat loss and more modern drivers. Whereas amphibians were much slower to start their decline, but then with the destruction of wetlands and the spread of diseases like chytrid fungus, we see a dramatic increase in the loss of amphibian species in more modern times, to the point where we've lost around 2.5% of the amphibian species that existed in the 1500s. And this little grey wedge down the bottom here is the combined expected from the geological timescale, from the fossil record, number of extinctions that we would have observed just according to the background rate of extinction. So you can see that that's why we're talking about extinction rates compared with the geological time record of around 100 to 1,000 times the background extinction rate, which is why we sort of call this the Anthropocene extinction crisis. So what are the global drivers of this loss? Again, the IPBES does a good job of summarising these drivers. Since the 1700s, we've seen 75% of land area significantly altered. That's in terms of vegetation cover and those basic ecosystem functions that used to occur in those lands. 66% of the ocean is experiencing increasing cumulative impacts, whether that's in acidification, warming, accumulation of plastics and other waste. 85% of wetlands have been lost since the 1700s. 85% of wetlands. It's astonishing, and obviously a really strong part of the driver of fish, bird and amphibian decline. Half of live coral cover is lost since 1870. I'm not sure, Paul, whether that's a contemporary statistic or whether you'd update that. And invasive species, another really major driver of extinction globally, are implicated in around 60% of current extinctions, and globally cost around $420 billion a year to the global economy. Zooming in on the Australian context, we have this incredible natural legacy here in Australia to be so proud of, but then to be so strident in our protection of. So we're one of the 17 megadiverse nations on the planet. We've got more species here than any other developed nation. And most of those species can't be found anywhere else. So we have 87% of our mammals, 93% of our reptiles are endemic to Australia, can't be found anywhere else. So it's an incredibly unique biota that we have here in this country. But unfortunately, since European invasion of Australia, we've had pretty much a linear increase in the formal recording of extinctions in Australia. So this just tracks the cumulative number of extinctions since Europeans started impacting on the Australian continent. And you can see there at the time of around 2015, we're up to around 100 formally recorded extinctions. More recent work, particularly led by John Winarski and others, focusing on what the impacts of of agricultural practices and catastrophic environmental changes is meant for invertebrate biota, we're probably looking more in the thousands of species that have gone extinct since the late 1700s. But they are obviously yet many of those species possibly not even documented by Western science. They probably disappeared before Western scientists even came up with a name for them. So that's I guess a pretty grim picture. And of course, we've already lost 10% of the mammals that existed when Europeans arrived here in Australia. That represents 30% of global mammal extinctions since that time. So we sort of are the Don Bradman of mammal extinctions, unfortunately. There's a couple of fantastic ones. We now have over 2,000 species listed at risk of extinction under our EPBC Act. And just brace yourself a little bit. Actually, that was not as shocking as it sometimes is. It can be much louder than that in auditoriums. That is the last ever recorded call of the Christmas Island pipistrelle when a team was finally sent to try and secure a captive population of the pipistrelle on Christmas Island. They recorded one call once, and then that was it. And that will never be heard again. Sad. And of course, extinction is the end point of a decline in a species, and obviously we're seeing a lessening of species everywhere. So this is the Australian Threatened Species Index here, and what that does is it looks at the benchmarked population estimates for species at a particular baseline date. So at 1985, we're going to call the index 1, and what that line does, looking across all of 900 species that are included in the index, looking at what their proportional change is year on year in the actual abundance of that individual species, so the number of individuals of that species. And so you can see that on average, the population sizes of species has declined by about 50% across birds, threatened birds, plants, mammals, amphibians, and other species that are in this threatened species index. So that means that since Nikki and I were rocking out to Madonna and George Michael in the 1980s, the mid-80s, it does not seem like that long ago, there are now approximately half the number of individuals of those species. And this is actually reflected in the Living Planet Index, which is a global index as well. We're seeing, on average, a halving of the population sizes of all of the monitored species in that Living Planet Index. And that can sometimes, when it's slow, be a hard thing to pick up because we have this issue of shifting baselines. We forget. I took my kids to Ningaloo last week. They thought it was bloody amazing. It is bloody amazing, but it's very different to when I was there in the mid-1990s. 2/3 of it is white. And so there's this issue that if you don't have a good baseline, things can change a lot and you don't even notice. And one of the things that people are noticing is changes in things like Christmas beetles, bogong moths. I had a call yesterday, that's why I put the bat here, from a bat shelter where they're saying all the pups, the bat pups are showing this malnutrition disorder, and we don't know what it is. We've been recording bogong moth abundance in the Alps just near whereby they're getting these bats come into the shelter. And they're asking me, is it because of insect decline? Because they're seeing this malnutrition disorder in bats and they get inflamed joints, and it's so painful that they have to euthanize the baby bats. And so there's these knock-on effects that we're already seeing, and we know that declines in things like bogong moths are leading to declines in things like mountain pygmy possums. They underpin the whole alpine ecosystem's food chain, and if we see a catastrophic decline in bogong moths, it's sad in and of itself. It's going to lead to very many other species going down. So biodiversity loss here in Australia, Anthony Waldron and colleagues in Nature in 2017 identified us as having the second highest rate of biodiversity loss on the planet and the highest rate of any developed nation. We are also, in that same paper, tagged with being the most egregious underspenders on biodiversity conservation of any developed nation, and I'll come back to that in a moment. it's of course not just all about species. In fact, if we're thinking about our own existential concerns here, we probably would be focusing more on ecosystems. And this is some work led by Dana Bergstrom and a whole bunch of colleagues. I don't know if Nikki was involved in that one, from our Nest Threatened Species Hub a few years ago, that identified, using a consistent methodology, ecosystems across Australia showing strong signs of collapse. And so collapse in this case means, I'll take the example of the ash forests in Victoria, where the ash forests are the highest carbon storing ecosystem on the planet. That was written about by Brendan Mackey and David Lindemeyer a couple of years ago. It's not that hard to understand why when you walk into ash forests. These are trees, flowering plants that are nearly 100 metres tall. It's incredible forest. But because we're seeing fire frequencies returning at intervals that are inside the time of sexual maturity for this tree, so inside the 20 years it takes for an ash seedling to become sexually mature, they're not producing seed in time in order to regenerate. And we're seeing a switch in this ecosystem to a more acacia and grass-dominated ecosystem that won't store nearly as much carbon. It won't produce nearly the same quality of water. In fact, it'll soak up a lot more of that water. So that's what they mean by ecosystem decline, or if you like, the crashing of an ecosystem. And of course, you can all think of your favourite ecosystem where that's occurring. The kelp forests in Tasmania, the giant kelp forests is another well-documented example of around 95% loss in kelp forests. I think Graham Edgar and colleagues produced that statistic a couple of years ago. That's bottom left corner. I've already mentioned the Ningaloo and the bleaching, same in Barrier Reef. So these are 19 ecosystems around Australia showing serious signs of collapse. And so here in Australia, what are the drivers of this collapse? Well, of course, probably the number one driver, the one that we know is the number one driver of extinctions globally, is habitat destruction. So one of the statistics that I think is kind of interesting is that even since the introduction of the EPBC Act, our environment protection legislation, we've actually seen the loss of over 8 million hectares of mapped threatened species habitat since that time. That's half of England or the size of Tasmania. 94% of that was not even considered under the EPBC Act. It wasn't approved or not approved, it was just done. So we might imagine that quite a lot of that would be illegal clearing. 95% of private land in Victoria, yes, we have a particularly bad land clearing problem that happened a little while ago. 95% of private land in Victoria has been cleared already, and we're still seeing really high vegetation clearing rates across Australia. For example, in Queensland, 680,000 hectares were cleared in the 12-month period through 2018, 2019. And those rates, it's not a thing of the past. That habitat destruction continues. We also have a particularly difficult relationship with invasive species in this country. I think the last State of the Environment report pointed out that there's actually more introduced plant species in Australia than there are native plant species now, which was kind of shocking to me. It's an odd sort of statistic. But we know that feral cats alone kill around 360 million birds a year, a million birds a day. And there's all these other invasive species that we've seen, including invasive diseases like myrtle rust and invasive plant species, even trout that we introduced and now knocking out galaxid species throughout the eastern states at an incredibly high rate. So invasive species are a really strong driver of species loss here in Australia. I was going to ask you which invasive species is implicated in the largest number of extinctions here in Australia, but I think I already showed you the answer accidentally because this flips 2 slides ahead. Who wants to guess, if you didn't happen to see that slide, which species is implicated in the largest, apart from humans, the largest number of extinctions here in Australia? Rabbits. Thank you. Amazing. How did you guess that? Usually the audience takes about 10 minutes to guess that if we've got time, but and it's because most of our threatened species are plants. Rabbits when they get to plague proportions, are incredibly destructive for plant populations. And so in terms of our threatened species list here in Australia, rabbits are the big killer. But of course, all the other answers that people usually give, like pigs and goats and cats and foxes and stuff, are also really strong drivers of species decline. Climate change is an incredibly powerful driver now that we're going to see start to manifest more and more. We're already obviously seeing things like bleaching events. The picture on the bottom left over there is a photo of country near my place up in the mountains in Midamida, where the intensity of the 2019-2020 Black Summer fires was so great that all of the valley bottoms and the whole area is eviscerated, which is quite different to a lot of the fires that we've seen previously. Even the Ash Wednesday fires in '83 and other fires since then tended to leave little patches of green vegetation around in the gully bottoms in the wetter places. The strange thing about that fire, particularly in the southeast, and perhaps it was the same over here in the ground parrot habitat, was just the comprehensiveness with which it actually destroyed the habitats, which means it's going to take a lot longer for species that are actually to find their way back into those places, and for habitats to start to regenerate, and then species start to immigrate back into those places. Those Gondwanan forests up in North Queensland hadn't burnt since the last ice age, burnt in that fire. And there's a bunch of other just the extreme heat events knocking spectacled flying foxes out of the sky, and the hundreds endangered species as well. So climate change obviously is a very strong emerging driver for species loss. This graphic here is, I usually just put it up because it just helps bring home just how strong the climate change signal has become. And it's not a lecture about climate change, but they are all the countries on the planet, and what the blobs indicate is a big blue blob indicates that was a cool year compared with the long-term 100-year average. A big red or orange blob indicates a warm year, and you can see that as you get through the 90s, you just get a higher and higher rate of warm years to the point where it starts to get kind of absurd. And even since 2017, which was the end of this animation, we actually have seen warmer and warmer and warmer anomalies each year. So if you've got any climate denying relatives, that's a good slide to show them. The UN has adopted, I guess, these predictions of the extent of loss of habitat for different groups. I'm just showing the mammal one here at different levels of climate change. And so we're anticipating that step up between 2 degrees and 3 degrees is a dramatic step up in terms of changes to and loss of mammal habitat. These are based on models. There's uncertainty in models, but I think there tends to be a fair bit of kind of consistency around that step change that we see as we go from 1.5 towards 3 degree warming, and that's quite disturbing. I've got a couple of just example species down here, I guess, that we know have already been dramatically impacted by climate change. We're seeing the available climatic niche for lemuroid ringtails just retracting to the tops of mountains in North Queensland, so that really the places where they can possibly live, just because it's getting too consistently hot, are starting to shrink up the mountains. Obviously already lost the bramble camelomies through storm surge, sea level rise, and the western swamp tortoise. Maybe we'll hear a little bit about that. Maybe Nikki might tell us a story about declining inflows into the natural range areas, and the warming of those waters, and the ability for that species to reproduce here just around Perth. So a lot of species obviously starting to already show the impacts of climate change. So it's not surprising, I guess, that the World Economic Forum, so this is not even the IPBES or pointy head greenies like me from universities, but like the World Economic Forum, a pretty dry bunch to be honest, are rating biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse in the top 2 threats to medium-term threats to the global economy. So this is the sort of 10-year, they do this survey every year of economists around the planet of what are the main threats. And they're short-term threats, and of course, you know, everyone just talks about Trump now, but the medium-term threats are often these environmental things that they're actually seeing as the major threats, well above societal polarisation, cyber espionage and other things. So that's, I guess, a sobering message from the economists. So what's happening in policy to start to address these major changes, these huge challenges that we're seeing? So many of you will have heard about the Global Biodiversity Framework that was ratified in Montreal towards the end of 2022. 195 states plus the EU signed on to this Global Biodiversity Framework underneath the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there's a couple of key goals, I guess, and targets that are enunciated under this Global Biodiversity Framework. One of them is to try and conserve 30% of the earth by the end of the decade, that is land, sea, waterways. Also to restore 30% of degraded lands by 2050. So, we have a fighting extinction target, which is to halt human-induced extinctions of known threatened species by 2050. And this one I often put up because I think it's probably one of the more interesting and exciting of the targets coming out of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a commitment by all countries to ensure that large transnational companies disclose both the risks in terms of dependency and impacts on biodiversity. And I'll talk about that a bit later if I've got time. But I think that's probably one of the levers that we're yet to pull as a society to try and actually start to turn this massive decline around that might hold some promise, might also hold some risks. Just a couple of other broader sort of global policy contexts. The EU has started to introduce laws. They're actually codifying in law their restoration targets in the EU. That's good. Not quite sure what the penalties are for the EU for not meeting those targets. But one of the really tangible things that they're doing is that they're actually they're setting up laws now that are going to ban the importation and sale of products in the EU that have land clearing in the supply chain, which is a really important development. So obviously that's already starting to cause a stir in a lot of businesses in Australia, particularly in the ag sector, where land clearing is still part of the business model. And so, this is why I think in some ways this partly regulated, partly self-motivated business orientation around nature is an exciting opportunity, and that's a very tangible example of where someone in Europe doing something that might really change things that happen here in Australia and in other parts of the world. We had a great deal of excitement just after the last election when Minister Plibersek announced that we were going to have this nature positive plan, and it was much fanfare, and we were all very enthusiastic, I guess, about the prospects of a new kind of regulatory and incentive environment here in Australia for biodiversity, including in the nature positive plan, zero human-mediated extinctions by 2030, which was a very ambitious target. So no new extinctions after 2030. We're going to protect 30% of terrestrial and marine ecosystems by 2030. We will have an independent environment protection agency that will have teeth, that we're going to adopt the recommendations of Graham Samuel in his last review of the Environment and Biodiversity Conservation Act. We'll have a national data agency so we can track our progress towards these good outcomes, and the most comprehensive remake of environmental law since the EPBC Act was introduced in 1999. So that's the promise of the Nature Positive Plan. So how's that going so far? This drawing by the late Michael Leunig, I think, sort of characterises for me how we're kind of going with the Nature Positive Plan. It's been a total shift. We've had exactly no new nature laws. Well, we do actually technically have one new nature law, and it's about protecting salmon farmers, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We continue to have totally inadequate funding. I'll also touch on that. We definitely do not have an independent EPA or even an EPA, and there's been a little bit of progress on the 30 by 2030 promises, largely around identifying large parks in places that nobody's really contesting. So I guess it's a fairly long story that could be cut fairly short around the nature laws. Needless to say, there were literally thousands of hours of person time put in by suckers like myself and others who thought we were going to have new nature laws that were going to mandate national environmental standards, and we all spent lots of time either in Canberra or on hideous Zoom calls trying to work through the wording of these standards and working with, all the players, the NFF, the Minerals Council, the Business Council and the like. And we were making a lot of really, I thought, pretty good progress. We actually had a full draft of the new laws. We had a full draft of national environmental standards. We thought we were ready to go, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. It dragged on for 2 years, and the Minister's office doing stuff like building a nature repair market instead of actually pushing through the legislation around the new nature laws. And then finally, in the last throes before the election, we thought we were about to get a deal through to have the new nature laws and the standards enshrined in new legislation, and well, you guys messed it up, let's face it. Sorry, no. But I'm sure you all know the story about the incursion that Roger Cook and the Prime Minister made to essentially torpedo that. There's not much more to say, well, apart from letting Maxwell Smart. I don't know if any of you are, some of you will be old enough to remember that fantastic show. So we nearly got there, but we didn't. It's not totally off the table, and there are political scenarios in which we will still potentially get nature laws in the next term, but it's a roll of the dice. One government will do it, maybe. One government won't, definitely, and a minority government probably would. So yeah, look, I guess a lot of you who read the papers will have noticed that we do have one new nature law, which is that a minister can no longer revisit the conditions of an approval in light of new evidence. So the new evidence we're talking about in this case would have been the skate in the harbour in Tasmania. That's an endangered species that's being driven to extinction by the salmon farming there. There was a chance that the minister may have decided to impose more constraints on the salmon farmers. That was not going to be palatable just in front of an election, and so the Prime Minister actually changed the EPBC Act with the support of the opposition to make sure that that was not going to be possible, that the Environment Minister couldn't review a decision based on new evidence. And they're framing that as just around salmon. Clearly that's not. That the implications of that legislation are very far-reaching, and it means that if a new species appears in a place where an approval had taken place, we can't change the conditions of that approval now, even if it involves eviscerating all of that species habitat. So that's actually quite a big and quite dangerous change. Anyway, do Australians want stronger nature laws? I mean, this is an interesting question coming into an election and with all of this that's happening around that. The Biodiversity Council runs what we call a Biodiversity Concerns report every year, and we've got a little link down there that's a bit cut off, but you can have a look at that if you have a chance. And basically we survey over 3,000 people. It's 3 or 4 times the size of your average news poll, which is, what people really worry about coming up to an election. So it's a pretty robust survey. And there's a couple of things that we've noticed. Less than 5% of people actually oppose stronger nature laws, and around 75% of people are strongly in favour of stronger nature laws. There's a couple of other things here. In particular, people are strongly in favour of protecting species habitat from developments such as mines and urban expansion and other things. And there's a range of other things there around national standards, around establishing conservation areas and the like. And you can see the picture is pretty consistent across, strangely, So we have the demographic data behind these respondents, including who they vote for and that sort of thing. Obviously, there's the predictable associations, but you don't get 75% of people wanting stronger nature laws if only the Greenies and some of the Labor Party people want it. It's much more widespread than that. So that's probably, one of the core messages, I guess, to come out of our biodiversity concerns survey. I'd love you to have a peek at it at some point. Are Western Australians any different, apart from the obvious features of their surf, tans, teeth and budget surpluses? And look, this is just comparing New South Wales and Eastern State and WA. Unfortunately, you're exactly the same. There is no difference in the overall support for nature laws, the support for national parks, the support for anything. You're basically within 1 or 2% of all of the other states. So it's consistent, these trends across the states. But maybe the stakes are higher here, and when you do get vested interests playing into public decisions, maybe the damage is greater. I don't know, let's explore that in the panel. So finally, my first thing that I think reasonable people should expect from our leaders, stronger nature laws and independent EPA to ensure that they're being applied. You probably could have predicted I was going to say that. Funding is something that we sweat on a lot because without funding, you cannot save species and you can't restore ecosystems. These promises that we made to the planet that we were going to do under the GBF and also under the Nature Positive Plan. At the moment, our current funding targeted towards threatened species conservation and recovery is around $120 to $200 million a year. And total environment expenditure, which is around $400 to $500 million a year, that represents less than 6 cents for every $100 of the Australian budget. So 0.006 of the Australian budget is spent on the environment at the moment. We have done various studies to try and figure out how much it would actually take to prevent further extinctions here in Australia, including this one that was published a couple of years ago. We found that we'd need around $2 billion a year in order to prevent any further extinctions of Australian threatened species that are listed under the EPBC Act. Not particularly controversial, not that big a number. I'll come to how big a number that is in a minute. More recently, we've been working with Paul's mob here, the Marine Conservation Society, to figure out what that amount is for marine species to prevent any extinctions of currently listed marine species. And we found that that was around $340 million a year. Was what we would need. So let's say we're at about $2.5 billion a year. This is to conserve the threatened species in marine and terrestrial environments. And we've been working with the Wentworth Group and other groups to figure out what the other costs would be in terms of restoring ecosystems and the like. And we've come up with a number. And it's about $7 billion a year, which would represent 1% for nature, which is a neat kind of round number. 1% of national budget for the environment seems like a reasonable number. And we've had a little bit of cut through with some predictable recipients of our information. And we think we can pay for that. At the moment, we have also done another study that looks at harmful subsidies to the environment. That's that study on the left there. And we've calculated that around $25 billion a year of Commonwealth government money is spent on things like fuel tax credits to coal mining companies, new ports so that we can export our coal and our gas faster, grants to ag, fishery and forestries and mining organisations. So $25 billion is a lot more than 7 a year. So if we just start to address the harmful subsidies that we provide. And the other thing is, last year, you and me and all of our friends spent around $35 billion on our cats and our dogs. That's just like doggy baths and Diamante collars for cats and all that sort of stuff. $35 billion. So even just the GST on that would pay for half of what we're asking for the national budget to conserve our natural heritage. So, do Australians agree with us? Yes, they do. In fact, most Australians, that top line, think we're already spending more than that. So we ask what they think we're spending, and around 20% of people thought we might be spending less than 1% of national budget on nature, and the remaining, 80% or 77% actually assumed that we were. So what did they want? 95% of people want us to spend more than 1% of national budget on nature. You won't be surprised to learn. So there's a pretty good signal to any budding politician. Number two, what would people expect? Appropriate levels of funding to prevent extinctions and restore ecosystems in line with national and global promises. And we know that when you spend money on nature conservation, it actually works. And I can show you some data from the US that shows recovery when you have mandated national spending. Nikki, how am I going for time? Fine. Oh, great. Oh, well. Can I slow down? No. Another sort of interesting finding, I think, of the Biodiversity Concern Survey is that the environment, when we asked people, name 3 top issues that you think are important to you coming up to an election, about half of the people include the environment in their top 3. This year, not last year, and probably not next year, 76% of people said it was about cost of living. But the thing that's sort of heartening for us is that the environment, along with the economy and healthcare, are in that peloton of issues coming second after cost of living. So why is there no interest in the environment in this current election? And, give yourselves a hand, in WA, the environment comes above the economy when we partial out the WA number, which makes me think that you've all probably just got too much money. And so there's a bit of a disconnect, I guess, that's worth thinking about, which is that despite all the grim that we go around saying all the time, or particularly me, but lots of people, despite the scientific evidence, the consistent findings, the nasty stuff that you see on telly and on Four Corners, 65% of Australians still believe that the environment is in good shape. And if you say good or fair, it gets up to 84%. So there's this disconnect between the things that we're saying, the evidence that we're seeing in the science and traditional owner evidence around what's happening to country and what's happening to species, that's not making it into the public consciousness yet. So we've still got a big job ahead of us to raise that awareness so that we actually have, extinction crisis as an election issue. Just a little bit of a twist sideways here. I thought this was an interesting byproduct of the Biodiversity Concern Survey. I don't know if any of you heard about 4 or 5 months ago, this brand of beer that we have in the eastern states called Great Northern. I don't know if you have it here. Everybody drinks it. And they decided that they were actually going to provide funding, some of their super profits, to organisations to buy private land to put into national park, which seemed like a nice thing for them to do, especially because all their ads show pictures of people in beautiful places drinking their beer. And then there was this huge backlash that was brought about by people who resent the fact that when land gets converted from state forest into national park, they can no longer do burnouts in the creeks and stuff in their four-wheel drives. And these guys like this dude here, Marcus Sutherland, went on a sort of campaign against Great Northern, calling them woke and et cetera, and they were boycotting the beer. And here's him pouring out a can of Great Northern because he can no longer stand the taste of it because they wanted to give money to increasing the size of the national park estate. And what we were able to do with the Biodiversity Concern Survey data is go to Great Northern and also go to the media and say, well, actually, only 5% of people object to the establishment of national parks. 95% of people want more national parks or don't care. So what this says to me is that there's this small proportion of people, lobbyists, vested interests, who are having a disproportionately big influence on policy, politics, and public perception. You might be able to think of some other people who also have a disproportionate influence. So, I won't go into this too much, but I think this is a real issue for us. There's this disconnect between what politicians think the public think and what their top priorities are, and in fact what their top priorities are when you actually ask them. And this is something that I think is really important because it determines how effective vested interests who are actually damaging the environment can be in the political sphere. And they can actually say, everybody doesn't want national parks, you know, look at this TikTok campaign, when in fact that's less than 5% of the population. All right, so in summary, in Australia we have declining biodiversity, failing laws, failing policy, inadequate funding, high public motivation for stronger laws and greater funding, but low public understanding that there is a crisis. Therefore, we have low political will for change in the parliament and low political will to push back against vested interests. Okay, so that's my kind of summary. People really care for the environment, and that's what we're finding more and more. They don't quite understand that there's a crisis, but they're not currently pushing in on politicians and others to actually do something about it in enough numbers. So, what should we want? I think we should want governments to govern for the future and for nature and people, and not for vested interests. Again, probably a fairly predictable expectation. And I started developing a list about what I think individuals, people like us, can do. We need to speak up because our friends, our families, people around us don't think really there's a problem yet. Well, your family and friends probably do because you're probably all quite outspoken about it. But this is so important that we start to get the message out there more widely that there is a bit of a problem and we really need to do something about it. And there are some simple things we can do, like just spend 1% of our budget on nature. And therefore also get political, support politicians who are promising the right things and then hold them to account. All right, there's some challenges and opportunities coming up. I would have been pretty clear, I hope, that climate change is a massive potential threat to biodiversity and a huge upcoming impact. Can you give me a 5-minute warning when I have 5 minutes left? So we have to transition, and particularly we have to transition our energy economy because that is one of the huge drivers of climate change globally, and in Australia, particularly here. We're producing energy not just for ourselves but for the rest of the planet that is accelerating climate change. So we have to transition. So Net Zero Australia is a collaboration of energy engineers and other people who sweat on what's it going to take to get us to net zero by 2050 or ideally sooner, so that we can address this climate crisis. And they have mapped the infrastructure that would be needed in order to hit net zero. Rough first pass map. And it's a bit terrifying. So this is the map on the left. It's like, here's the transmission pathways that are going to get the energy from the big solar arrays, from the big wind farms and the like, and the hydrogen plants, to the ports and to the population centres. Now, it's not nearly as catastrophic. I'm just giving you a spoiler here. It's not nearly as catastrophic as it looks on that map, but most people don't understand the scale of the infrastructure change that we have to go through in order to be net zero by 2050 or sooner. You know, some people want it by 2035. It's immense. The build is very, very big. This is a map of species richness in Australia. You kind of get the picture, right? Where we're doing the big energy infrastructure development stuff is where the species richness, the high biodiversity value areas are. And I haven't got a map of the sea here, and maybe others can talk to us about that when we get to the panel. So we have to be really careful. This is the good news. We have analysed, just starting in Queensland, where would you put an energy grid using the energy grid optimisation that these energy engineers use to map us a pathway to 2050. We said, taking into account all of the biodiversity values, and I won't tell you how I got to that map, but in the top left-hand corner, that's a biodiversity value map that looks at species, threatened species, rarity, and other aspects. And combine that with the wind energy potential map, the blue one, the solar energy potential map, the red one. With the engineers, we modelled where would you put the energy infrastructure in order to avoid 30% of the highest biodiversity areas and still meet the energy targets that we have for Queensland in order to hit net zero by 2050. So we came up with a solution, and it looks a little bit like that. That's the energy infrastructure map, including projects, wind and solar, and the transmission lines. If you said, well, now let's avoid the top 50% of nature value, this is where the map would paint. Let's avoid 70% of the nature value, so the bulk of the nature, high biodiversity value areas. And if you were going to avoid 90%, where would you put your projects? Where would you put your infrastructure? And so we've produced a map, and you see the 90% one looks pretty different to the 30% one. It pushes you into different places to do your energy generation and to put your transmission. That's going to cost the earth, right? So we figured out how much it would cost. And the blue bar on the left is how much the energy transition is going to cost if you ignore biodiversity altogether. And the red bar on the right, thanks, is how much it's going to cost if you conserve 90% of all of the biodiversity. So almost complete biodiversity preservation. And what we've found is the costs at 2030, 2040 and 2050 are within 5% of the baseline cost. So this is a good news story. This means we can do energy transition, hit our targets and avoid the biodiversity values at almost no cost. Like to engineers, 5% is rounding error, especially when you're talking out to 2050. So one reason to be optimistic. Here's some other reasons. There are great people around the planet doing fantastic things. Companies like Wood for Good and Greening Australia are doing land restoration in order to secure carbon credits and also to potentially secure biodiversity credits, or just doing it in a high biodiversity way. Yes, there are shysters, and yes, the ACCU scam was real, but there are good people doing good things, and we can do this. And we've got studies that show that there are really fantastic ways of doing carbon planting in a way that's good for nature. We don't have to have engineering solutions to prevent storm surge damage anymore. We can do ecosystem or nature-based solution approaches. There's some fantastic examples there. I won't go into detail at the moment. To stop ourselves baking in our cities at 2 and 3 degrees, why don't we have nature-positive urban developments? Here's a fantastic bit of work by Sarah Beckersey from RMIT, where they've worked together with architects and designers to look at what they might be able to install in terms of habitats into local areas. Possibly they wouldn't get brolgas actually into the apartments, but you get the picture. And we're also seeing dramatic changes in the business and biodiversity landscape, partly as a result of Target 15 in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is saying that large companies actually have to disclose their risks and dependencies as part of their regular finance reporting. You've already had a lecture about finance, so I'm not going to go into that. We've got a long way to go in terms of business. Most businesses have a climate change strategy at the moment. Most businesses do not have a biodiversity strategy. So we do have a lot of work to do there, but that's a huge opportunity for us. There's been some fantastic early work by early adopters in this task force for nature-related financial disclosures. This is the mechanism by which we get businesses actually thinking about their impacts on nature and the opportunities to do better and the risks they face if they don't. And so this is great work, but we do have to be very careful about greenwashing around this issue. This is a big challenge. And for every company that's doing good at the moment, I suspect there are a couple of companies who might be taking the piss when it comes to reporting around nature. All right, this is my last slide. On net, we should ask for strong nature laws. We should look for appropriate levels of funding. We should look for governments that are actually going to govern for us and for the planet, not for vested interests. We should plan the energy transition. At the moment, we're not currently planning it, and that's why we're getting so much friction as we try and roll out renewable energy technologies. As individuals, we should speak up. We've got to tell our friends about what's happening and what they can do about it. Get political, support businesses that are doing the right thing and take notice and use your purchasing power. Donate, please. Groups like us, the Biodiversity Council, who do this kind of work in advocacy, can only do it with philanthropic support because governments don't give us money to point out what they're doing wrong. And do local action for your local environment, but also for your soul. Thanks very much.
Thank you.